So, very good afternoon to everybody joining us. And I know people are coming in slowly to join this conversation, which I am really excited about. And I will give a very warm introduction to Alistair in a moment. But let me just set the scene and give a couple of instructions before we get into the conversation proper. So the first thing, just to say on a kind of protocol basis, this meeting, this conversation rather, is being recorded, and it will then subsequently be uploaded to YouTube, where it will become a fantastic resource for everybody. But just to make you aware of that, we will invite people to participate. We want this to be very interactive, so we really encourage you to use the chat function on Zoom, but also equally, if you would like to switch on your camera and your microphone and ask Alistair a question, then you are most welcome. But just bear in mind that it is being recorded and it will be uploaded onto YouTube. So with all that being said, let's get started. So first of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm going to introduce Alistair in a moment. But my name is Philip Alford. I am CPAR Director at Southampton Business School. And CPAR, probably one of the longest acronyms in the university. It stands for Careers, Employability, Placements, and Alumni Relations. And I work very closely with my colleague, Dr. Rob Angel, who's in the audience today. And Rob and I and team, ably assisted by Daisy and Miriam and others, have put together this really exciting series of talks that we're calling Inspiring Journeys, where we invite alumni such as Alistair to come back, as it were, and share their experiences and really talk us through their journey before Southampton, life before Southampton, when they were at Southampton, and of course, subsequent to Southampton. But as I said earlier, we really want this to be a conversation. It's not a lecture. It's very important to make that clear. So, having introduced myself and the team, I'm going to do my best to introduce Alistair, but in his introduction, he may cover things that I have omitted. But Alistair was a student with us at Southampton back in the 80s, where he studied accountancy and statistics. Following that undergraduate degree at Southampton, Alistair then went on to have an extremely successful career as a chartered accountant, a 30-year career as a chartered accountant, principally with Price Waterhouse and Ernst Young. And Alistair will be sharing many insights from that career with us today. Following that, that stellar career, Alistair then, in some ways, I guess, went back into education again and joined the graduate school at the Department for Continuing Education at Oxford, where he studied for a postgrad certificate in historical studies, and history is one of his passions in life, and did an MSc in English Local History at Kellogg College at Oxford, and also did a DPhil in English Local History at the Harris Manchester College. Following this, he joined the part-time tutor panel and then went on to become a lecturer in November 19, so quite recently. And his role, and I find this is really fascinating, and it's going to be a theme we explore within our talk today, a role that he is now primarily focused on in the graduate school is on the design and delivery of a broad skills and development training program for the department's postgraduate students. He also teaches history. As I said, that's one of his passions as a subject. So there are lots of things that we're going to be able to explore with Alistair today, but I'm now going to, as it were, hand the microphone to him and invite him to do his own introduction, and then perhaps Alistair to start really at the beginning of your journey, which I guess is kind of, even going back to school years where you were, what inspired you and what took you down the route at Southampton. So Alistair, over to you.
Thank you very much, Philip. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me. It's and for joining us in this conversation. Just a couple of little gaps to fill on that very nice introduction. Thank you, Philip. Yeah, you said 1980s. It was 1980 to 83, so it's 40 years ago. And just reflecting on it, I mean, it was a very, very different working world, educational world, and world in general, really. And some of those themes might come out. It was a very different context that I studied into the ones that the students joining us today studied in. So perhaps that's something that we can explore. And just again, stepping back and reflecting on it, the technical areas I worked in were audit, corporate tax, and latterly for most of my career in expatriate tax. But I was lucky to have very many different experiences, which were possible because of being in that large organization environment. So basically, I'm sharing with you large organization experience today. As well as working in-house on a client basis and for management roles. So I also did a secondment to our training department. I worked overseas in Budapest in Hungary when Eastern Europe was starting to open up. I was seconded to a client. I worked in London offices, regional offices, including at Ocean Village. I spent time back at Ocean Village in Southampton, and overseas. And the different experience, I took something from each of them in my career journey. And it wasn't that I particularly planned it, but looking back, I can see how valuable that was. So yeah, perhaps we can explore, take the conversation whichever direction you and the audience would like to take it. But yeah, very happy to talk through any of those things. So yes, so just moving on then to the before Southampton stage, so into my later school, and just my early thoughts on careers and things. Well, I think originally I wanted to be a professional footballer, like probably many did. And I think by the time I'd reached under 14s, I realized that wasn't going to happen. It's still a big passion of mine, but that wasn't going to be my career. But as long as I can remember, in terms of serious career options, it was always business, finance, accounting sort of areas. I loved doing maths. I was always interested in numbers and economics and things like that. So that was always the general direction that I think I was heading. And accounting seemed like a very good choice at the time. So the late 70s, early 80s. So accounting was and still is, I think, a very secure and stable profession. And at the top levels, it can be very lucrative. It's also very flexible in that you can pursue it within a professional practice environment, or obviously in industry or in commerce. You can work in-house in tax departments and things. So it gives you a lot of choices. And the training that in the big firms that you get in terms of working on a lot of audits and things is that you see the inside of literally dozens of companies over the course of your 3-year training to become a chartered accountant. So you really get under the skin of how an organization ticks. So even if you don't end up pursuing your career in professional practice, it's a very good training. So a lot of people did the initial training and then went off on different paths, some into academia as well, of course. So it was a good, and I stayed in the professions, obviously, at least for the 30 years of my career. So it gave you a lot of choices. So then my choice was, okay, so I wanted to go into accounting, but what degree was I going to pursue? And the context is important here, Philip, because I was the first in my family to go to university. It wasn't a common thing to do. It was very different. I think, looking back, I think about 8% of people went to university. What is it now, 40, 45 something? It was a very different thing. No one had ever been in my family. It had an element of risk to it. You were giving up 3 years of earnings to pursue more training. So it wasn't an obvious thing to do. And I had to get financial backing, from the family and everything. My generation were often the first in their families to go. So it was a very different experience. And so I decided to do a relevant degree for my probable career path rather than my passion, which was history, which of course I've come back to 30 years later. But and I wanted an accounting-based, a business-based degree because firstly, it would prove to me that that's what I wanted to do for my career. So by immersing myself in the theoretical side of things for 3 years, I thought it would do that. From a practical point of view, it gave me exemptions from the professional exams, the Institute of Chartered Accountant exam. So you didn't have to do a conversion course. You could go straight into the professional exams. So that made sense. As I say, it confirmed very much that career path that I was on. So I chose particularly this subject, accounting and statistics, because it enabled me to do a bit of maths and a bit of business accounting. So it was an ideal one. I just applied to 2 universities. I applied to here at Southampton was my first choice. The other one was the University of Surrey at Guildford. And so particularly for, it had a good reputation even then. This is pre-business school, of course, long before the business school was established, but it had a very good reputation for business type training and courses. And so for me, it was about 60 miles away. So it was away, but not too far away. And I sort of knew the South. I'm from the South. And so it was, sort of familiar territory. As I say, the course sort of suited me. So so that was really the thinking before, and it brought me to Connaught Hall. Is that still? I think that still exists. Is it one of the halls of residence? Yeah, I was down at Connaught first, and everything in October of 1980 when I started. So it was a bit of a leap, because as I say, it was unusual in my generation to be doing this.
I appreciate that, Alistair. That's really interesting, and it's you mentioned about the context of study was very different then, and obviously the first in your family to go to university. So there's maybe things we can explore there, but just then, coming, I guess, into your time at Southampton, can you tell us a little bit about your experience while you were at university, not only on the course itself, but maybe things beyond the course? I know you're a big advocate of, as it were, seizing the opportunity. So perhaps you could maybe expand on that a little bit for us.
But yes, and perhaps my specific context is a bit contradictory, perhaps, to what I would now sort of advocate from that perspective. So we can talk about that. So I think because I was the first from the family, and because there was a financial commitment and everything, I was really, really focused on my studies. I have to be honest about that, in acquiring knowledge and developing skills, because I felt a sense of obligation really to make the most, and I wanted to prove to myself and everyone that I had made the right decision. And so with my children, they naturally flowed into university, but as I say, the context is different. So that's really important, I think. And looking back, so I went to every learning opportunity. I didn't miss anything. I went to every learning opportunity and all the slightly extracurricular things that were on offer. And I had fabulous tutors. I thought they were good at the time, but looking back now, I just Googled some of them because I can remember the names very clearly from 40 years ago. So Mahmoud Izamal, Cecilia Marmolinero. Graham Misen taught me. I see he's an emeritus professor here still at Southampton. So, and I look back and I see what fabulous careers they've had. And I was very fortunate to be taught by great tutors. And I firmly believe that you've got to seize the moment and the opportunity and take advantage of working with people who are truly world-class in their fields. And, you've got this fabulous opportunity of 3 years of undivided attention, largely around a particular subject to set the foundations for your career, and, making the most of that opportunity. I did other things as well, of course. So I can remember playing golf at the municipal course at the top of the avenue. I can remember watching the Saints play at the Dell, and Hampshire used to play at Bannister Park before they went to the Rose Bowl cricket. I remember going bowling at Bitton and things, but I didn't party and socialise as much as others, and I did take my studies very seriously, because in those days you could differentiate yourself as a student through your results, because of that 8%, only 5% got first. It was a very different environment. Whether you got a first or a 2-1 was going to be pretty crucial to your career aspirations in a different way than perhaps it is today, where you look for other differentiators. So I really enjoyed my time. The other really important thing I did, Philip, with looking back on it, although I was very focused whilst I was in my 3 10-week terms, as we had at the time, is that I worked in an accounting practice in the vacations. I just basically we just knocked on doors. I think. I worked for a small 2-partner practice in Farnham in Surrey, and if you think about it now looking back, I just wanted again to prove to myself that this is the working world that I wanted to get into, but it was a completely different one to my theory. So here I am at Southampton, and I'm learning about current cost accounting or capital asset pricing models or things, theoretical things. And then I'm working in this small firm in Farnham, and I've got 2 carrier bags of information, and I need to create a set of accounts from it. So it's a completely different but complementary experience. And I think in my day, we had to go and find those things for ourselves, or it was down to you. In fact, it wasn't really encouraged in the same way as it should be today. It was, you've got your 3 years and focus on your studies, but actually I thought it was important to do that that practical aspect as well. And I know from my, sorry, yeah.
Sorry, Alistair, sorry to interrupt you. I just want to pick up on a couple of those things, if you don't mind me just interrupting you for a moment. So there's a couple of things you said there that I thought were really interesting, was that you used the word to differentiate. And you'd mentioned about, you know, how things are different in your context in the 80s, and they might be now for students listening to this talk today. But I guess by the same token, two things to me seem constant actually with what you've said. Number one is still the need to differentiate. And that's maybe something I'll ask you to comment on in terms of how you, what advice would you give to students that are listening, and indeed maybe actually to our alumni, you know, because we've got alumni in our audience as well. That's the first thing I'll ask you to comment on, and then obviously, you know, to continue what you were going to say. But the second thing you mentioned I thought was really interesting was just how on the front foot you were in terms of going knocking on doors, as you put it, to get that all important experience, because I think you summed it up so nicely there with the carrier bag analogy, that, you know, you were learning these high level theories, which are of course important to learn, but then you had that sort of reality check, as it were, when you were at the firm. And that's still something I would suggest is very true for today's students. And we're very, very strong on experiential learning here, Alistair, and trying to get students not just to learn the theory in the classroom, and that's really important, but also to have the opportunity to apply that. So maybe if I could ask you just to maybe comment on those aspects for me.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the differentiation first, so obviously I'm from this large employer, these large multinationals now. It's a big four professional service firm, some of the largest organizations in the world. So that they obviously want the best of the best. Okay, so and it ratchets up another, not, you know, so you might be one of the best here at Southampton, but then you're joining the best from everywhere else in the country, you know. So and literally I did a lot of recruiting and interviewing and throughout my career at different levels, but obviously you have to stand out just to get an interview. You have to stand out, you know. Just having a good 2-1 from Southampton will not get you, you know, that's necessary, but it's not sufficient. You know, it's not nearly sufficient. So so obviously you've got to something in your experience that you present has to differentiate you, and you're looking obviously as an employer for a little bit of hunger and motivation. So obviously any work experience is good, I think, and my kids learnt a lot from doing bar work and cafes. You learn about teamwork and all sorts of things, you know, responsibility, but obviously if it's relevant, directly relevant practical experience, that shows that you are emotionally invested in this possible career. I mean, if I could just turn it on its head, over the years I've done come to the career open days, or the milk rounds we used to call it, you know, and I remember PhD students coming up to me without really having any idea what we even did, you know, just because they thought, well, my PhD will, you know, that will get me in, sort of thing. But sorry, I mean, intellectual rigor has to be at a sufficient level, obviously, but then you're looking for at an original student interview state, you're looking for potential, you're looking for hunger, you're looking for attitude, the way that you present your material in a nice, concise way. So having relevant practical experience, if you've got these programs that you mentioned, Philip, if you've got opportunities for placement, and I think it's more organized. I think we all did 3-year courses when I was studying, you know. Now I think my son and my daughter both did placements in their career fields, my niece as well, and I think they've, you know, certainly embraced those opportunities. I did we did a large intern program at EY. I think most of the big four do, and so I worked with interviewing and being shadowed by intern students, internships, secondments, placements, anything that shows that you are really serious about this career that you're applying for will help to, you know, to differentiate you. So it's almost like you know, there's a bar that you have to reach intellectually, but then it's what else have you got on top of that?
That's really interesting. So we're almost certainly, Alistair, have quite a few students in our audience today who are studying related areas. And here I think we'll move on a little bit I think what we'll do is we'll cycle backward and forwards is absolutely fine.
Yeah.
But you mentioned your career with the Big Four, with Ernst Young and with PwC as well, and that you were involved in interviewing and work shadowing and having interns in there. So thinking about, you know, some of the students that might be in our audience today, Alistair, who would be interested potentially in working for one of those big firms, if you were to say to them, well, what can they do right now while at Southampton to kind of increase their likelihood there, what advice would you give?
So it's being able to demonstrate, as I say, that interest and passion and understanding. So I'll give you a specific example for one thing that did impress me that's ended up. So a neighbour of mine, 2 doors down the road here, they moved away. One of they had 4 sons. One of the sons was obviously expressed some interest in getting into the consulting field at EY. They came back and saw me. So the young lad, he came back to find out what the working culture was like, you know, what it was really like working within the firm. You can do your desk research, can't you, on how big an organization is and where its offices are and all that sort of thing. But can you go an extra step to get under the skin of an organization a little bit more, so that you're better placed when you have your interview or when you put your presentation together to differentiate yourself and show just a little bit more knowledge, awareness and understanding that others have. And so I was quite impressed. They got the internship and now they've got the job. You know, I mean, I could see that the cultural fit was going to be there. And that's the other thing that when I was interviewing, you're assessing, am I going to be comfortable putting this person in front of a client? Am I going to enjoy working with them as a colleague? You know, is there a cultural fit? Every organization, every large company has a distinctive culture, really. I mean, the words will be the same, but actually living and working there are always a bit slightly different. So as a student, have you gone out of your way to do as much as you can to know as much as possible about that organization? So it's that sort of hunger being demonstrated, as well as some relevant practical experience, or perhaps you're associated with an organization. I think it was ISEC in my day, you know, a business and commercial organization. Have you been to talks? Are you well read? I remember Michael Brown, one of my tutors, telling me you've got to read the FT every day. You know, and just, you know, it'll become easier. It seems hard now, but you've got to be on top of. And in my interviews, you know, being asked about macroeconomic situations and business developments and being able to have a view and an opinion and argue and support it. So it's all about it's preparing. You know, I mean, when you're doing your finals, I always thought that preparing for your job was your application was like another course. You know, I mean, you have to take it seriously because employers have so many to choose from.
That's really, really incredibly pertinent advice. And you know, to sum it up, you're doing a great degree at Southampton, but you need to put the icing on the cake, so to speak. And as you say, go the extra step or go the extra mile and understand better the culture of the organization. And that the only way to do that perhaps is to speak to somebody from the organization, as you say, to get under the skin of the organization and have those, as you say, differentiators from the competition, who are also, as you say, the best that are going for that job. And you're right to say, you know, it is more perhaps organized in some ways, Alistair, in that we provide many opportunities to do short internships, longer placements, live projects, and obviously we have a wonderful alumni network of which you are part of. And you know, I know we talked about mentoring, and that's perhaps something we could go on to chat about in a moment. But just before we talk about your specific sort of roles and what you would share from your time at EY and PwC, and then I'd like also then to go on in your role at Oxford at the moment. You mentioned about, you know, that I was just fascinated by the 2 carrier bags with the company in Farnham. I mean, what would you say that experience and others like it, because I'm sure you were knocking on other doors during your summer vacation as well. What did that give you, Alistair, do you think?
It brought home really the reality of the profession I'd chosen, you know. I mean, but at a completely different level, because obviously EY has, I don't know, we had 10,000 people in the UK, 150,000 around the world. This was a 2-partner practice in Farnham. So it was the other end of the accounting profession, but it was extremely practical. And but I had to get over a huge culture shock. As I say, I remember on day one, just really not having, I mean, I'd studied all this theory, and here I was, and I was given a box of incomplete records, literally 2 carrier bags or a shoebox. It was quite typical, and asked to produce a set of accounts, and really struggling, and really was this really what I wanted to do? You know, was this really what I wanted to do? But where I benefited was that the partner who'd given me the opportunity at £50 a week, I seem to remember, when he invested time with me. You know, so I benefited from his engagement. It wasn't as you're no use to me, off you go. You know, he actually spent a day or so and pointed me in the right direction. I think his son worked for the practice. He put me in an office with him, and he invested a little bit of time with me up front. Yeah, that first week was very difficult, and then of course I'm very keen to pay him back. You know, because of that, because it's, and this is, networking and relationships are all important. You know, we might not have time to discuss that today, but you know, those sort of things are crucially important, down to those non-technical skills. And so I then apply every vacation. I asked to go back for 2 or 3 weeks, or you know, whatever, and just built up that practical knowledge and experience. And what that really, it also helped. It went sort of circular, because it really helped with my accounting theory studies at Southampton, because I could see the practical application. And it helped me, of course. I benefited from that experience when I went into the professional exams as well, because I had this bedrock of bookkeeping and accounting at the sharp end, which really sort of stood me in good stead. So it's finding the opportunities, which now might be a bit easier for students to do, but it's then making the most of them and accepting that it's not all going to be plain sailing. You know, you've got to build up in your career a bit of resilience. You know, you're going to have some setbacks, and you've got to plow on and be very clear in your own mind what you want to achieve. That's
great, Alistair. And then we will definitely come back very, very soon to those non-technical skills, as you referred to them. I just wanted to explore something you'd mentioned, obviously your time with Ernst Young. Obviously they're a very large enterprise, global enterprise. You'd mentioned your time in Budapest and regional offices and the rest of it. And of course that's wonderful, because you've got so many networking opportunities and so on. I guess though, working for a large enterprise comes with its own challenges as well, in terms of fitting into the culture and sort of making the most of your time there. Could you tell us a little bit? And just before you do, Alistair, I'll just remind our audience that we would love to hear some, you know, to get some chat messages coming in and some questions, because guys, if you know, for those of you listening, this is a wonderful opportunity for you to pick Alistair's brains in a good way and ask him for advice, or come with your own questions, because you know, we were saying at the beginning, we'd very much like this conversation to be in part led by the audience, and Alistair is very comfortable with being interrupted, and we will go to your message. But I was just going to ask you, Alistair, about your experience at Ernst Young and what advice you would give to students going into large enterprises like that in terms of making and optimizing their time there and being successful.
Well, the first thing, of course, is that you are a small part of a very big cog. You'll be in a team or a department or a section, and you know, I mean, it's the pluses of a large organization is fabulous resources and expertise. The difficulties are that you start in a small environment, so you've really got to work quite hard, or at least, well, it would be perfectly possible just to do your job, and if you're technically good, and just have a, you know, just progress nicely. But actually, if you want to make the most of the opportunities and become the, you know, the best that you can be, then take advantage of the breadth of opportunities that are available. So put yourself forward for things and go out of your way to network and build relationships that might just be beyond your immediate job spec, you know. So you go that extra mile in a different sense, in terms of connecting with someone, spending a bit of time with someone, just seeing if you can help them with something. You know, so you just make yourself a little bit more useful than your peers, really. I mean, it's you start marketing yourself internally in a way.
That's really fascinating.
And the beautiful thing is it makes it more enjoyable, because the more people you know, the more different sides of the business you're familiar with, you know, the more enjoyable everything becomes. So it's all about balance, but
Yeah, of course. So kind of in a way, the impression I'm getting there is your technical skills are, quote, a given. Now, of course, I'm assuming, as with today, Alistair, it's about constant knowledge acquisition and developing those technical skills. So I'm not saying you go in and then that's it. And we could maybe explore that. But we did say we would bring in those non-technical skills, and you've already alluded to some of them already about relationship building and networking. Could you perhaps give us an example from your time at EY or with PwC in terms of how you practically did that?
Yes, I will. And yes, you're right. So I'm a chartered accountant. I practiced accounting for the last probably 20 years of my career. You know, it was doing the softer or the non-technical skills. Your job becomes about something different. You need that bedrock of technical knowledge to be able to do the broader roles effectively. But but other people do those roles and learn and develop beneath you, and you do different things. So if I just let me take one example. So when I transitioned from corporate tax to expatriate tax, it was the in thing. Companies were becoming, globalization was taking hold. You know, companies had large workforces all over the world. It was the in area of tax to get into. I was at Southampton at Ocean Village at Price Waterhouse. I moved to their special expatriate tax unit. And my first client, I was a bit nervous about the first client because, you know, I was new into this particular area of tax. I dabbled a bit, but it was going to be new. But we immediately hit it off. That first client who was in their HR department, and but soon after they left. But I stayed in touch. They actually went to a prospect, then they went to a competitor. Then they went somewhere else. You know, so I followed this person around their career as part of my networking, and 10 years later or more, he goes back into an in-house role and wants to put his contract out for tender. So we then eventually win that tender, but I've got a 10 years start on my competitors because I've stayed in touch. Even when he was a competitor working for one of our competitors, I've kept that relationship going. And in a way, it was enjoyable because, you know, we get on, and I'm still in touch with him now. You know, I retired 10 years ago, but I'm still in touch with him. And so you do that by taking an interest in people, to be honest, you know, always understand what it means, what your performance, how it interacts with your client and what it means for them or your contact. So if we fail to deliver in Poland or something, you know, we're late applying for a work permit, or how does that make my client look internally? You know, what problem does that create for him? What problems if I overrun on my fee budget? You know, how can I help him not to fail personally? And I need to know about him as a person. You know, I mean, I've been in many sort of proposal meetings where people say, oh, I know X, I know Y, but they don't know who their spouse is or which football team they support. You know, you've got to really know people. It all boils down, all of the big four, great. It's not around how many offices, who has the best technicians, who has the office in, you know, the most offices, who has the most people. At the end of the day, it's about people and chemistry, and building what we were challenged to do, building friends in business. And you've got to do those things outside of delivering and selling. And as I think I shared with you in the prep, that I had to account for every 6 minutes of my time for 30 years. So you have targets of new revenue and billings for clients and all sorts of things, but taking time to take care of the next side, you know, building those long-term relationships is what's expected. So that's a softer skill that wouldn't be required of me to such an extent earlier on in my career, but would be later. And then the other general example, Philip, would be presentation skills are so important. And I benefited hugely from one of my secondments to the tax training department at PwC, where I used to hate presentations. You know, it used to make me so nervous. You know, even little internal presentations with lunchtime learning sessions, I used to hate it. But I was offered the opportunity to go into tax training for a year, and I made myself take that opportunity because I knew I would be presenting every week for a year, or several times a week for a year. And I came out of that secondment loving doing presentations, you know, really enjoying them and embracing them. And now when I thought about it towards the end of my career, everything was a presentation. You know, I'm presenting a pitch to a client, I'm presenting a tax case to HMRC, I'm presenting a business case for promotion, I'm presenting a budget for approval. Everything's about presenting, but I learned those skills, that softer skills of presenting through that secondment opportunity that I had. So you've got to own your own career in terms of be very honest about your self-development needs.
Sure. Yes, a self-awareness, and I'm getting the word empathy was kind of coming into my mind quite a bit there when you're talking about, you know, really knowing your client and all about them and putting yourself in there. Really fascinating. Alistair, I'm delighted to say we've got a couple of questions that have filtered through to me as direct messages. So I'll read them out and then you can take them. So we have a message from Karan. So Karan, thanks for your message. And his question is, and I'll just read it verbatim. How do I decide between a consulting firm like EY/PwC or working in industry? What are the key points to consider?
Okay, so I think the beauty of a professional service environment is probably going to be the breadth of the experience that you will come, because you will work with project by project on lots and lots of different clients, and that variety I find, you know, is personally quite stimulating and interesting. If you do an in-house role, and I said that one of my opportunities as well as the training, I was seconded to an in-house tax department, so same as your decision, but really from a tax rather than a consulting perspective. So that again gave me a completely different insight. That was what I saw was the relevance of my technical input to the whole commercial decision. So you have a practicality and a relevance in an in-house role, perhaps beyond being an advisor. Because you can see that I could see where tax fitted in. Tax was my be all and end all, but it was only a small part of the commercial decision, you know, which depended on all sorts of other considerations, which I could only really see in-house. So it's a different nature of role. And throughout your career, if you do a bit of both, then you're going to have the benefits of both. But I would say it's the variety and breadth of being an advisor and being a consultant against the ability to implement your decision practically in-house in a role.
I understand that, Alistair. It's interesting. I'm a humble marketing guy. The analogy for me for the marketing students listening would be working in a marketing role in a company versus working for an agency, a digital agency, for example, that would advise on different clients. It's a similar, just sort of interest, just push you a wee bit on that, if I may. Could you answer the question, which should come first? Is one better before the other?
Well, I obviously in my route, I had the breadth first, and then I decided I liked the breadth, and I was fortunate to get the opportunity to do that 6 months secondment. I think 6 months in-house. So I knew that myself, I could see the differences, but I was happy with doing it that way round. And I suppose the more common path would be to do the breadth into the in-house role. Right. Okay. But people did move in both directions. You know, we recruited people from in-house roles, but
well, I hope that helps Karan with his deliberations. But obviously, Karan, please feel free to come back on the chat if there's anything you'd like Alistair to really clarify on that. We have another question as well, Alistair, from Lucy. So again, thanks to Lucy for her message. I'd actually be quite happy, Lucy, it'd be great if you could maybe tell us who you are or tell us what course you're studying, or that would be great if you don't mind. But I'll read your question to Alistair. Hi, Alistair. I have a question. If you don't work with those people, so I think that this question may have come in, Alistair, when you were talking about, following people and that networking and so on. I think that's the context for her question. And you can't meet them in your daily life. I suppose in some ways that's a very pertinent question in the times we're living at the moment, Alistair, with COVID. What's the good way to stay in touch?
Yeah, that's interesting, because as you say, that the pandemic, I think I was lucky. I had more opportunities than the current workforce generation might have, especially if there's a lot more working from home. The obvious, excuse me, the obvious thing would be to invite them to conferences and seminars and other events. So you would, and these were always available through our marketing function, Philip. So, we would always have, presentations around the budget or technical updates or things that you could invite people to. And the important thing was to make sure that you only invited your people to relevant things for them, and that you didn't just blandly carpet bomb them with stuff which tended to annoy people. So you needed to know them well enough that this might be of interest. And so I will send a personal email saying, you know, here is this opportunity. So, and of course, in my day, we could have lunch with people. You know, you had lunches and coffees and with people, and you invested time around these things. So, or obviously you can mail material and things like that. It's not as good, of course. You do need the personal contact, I believe, to make these things work. So you use the advantage of the large organization was that so many things were happening, and in the technical world we were in, things were always changing, and you sought opportunities, or you just did things socially, just because I just invested time socially and getting to know people, and because I like them. Actually, one of the acid skills we haven't talked about is you've got to get on with people that you don't naturally gel with as well. You are opposite Myers-Briggs types to some people. You've got to be able to do that as well. But so you look for the opportunities. As I say, it's a different sort of governance and compliance world than mine. But I would have invested over the 30 years a lot of personal time just meeting people on social, on a social basis, and inviting them.
I guess you mentioned, Alistair, about meeting people on a social basis. I suppose the big game changer is the right term, is obviously with LinkedIn and social media. You mentioned about, if I go back to an earlier thing you said at the beginning about reading the FT daily, that could be that still important, but it could also be about listening to your favorite YouTuber or podcast. And equally, it might be, striking those links up on LinkedIn. But then again, that brings us into the story then of how you then maybe go the extra mile and really build a personal relationship with people.
I'm pre-social media, but I mean, I can see the power of it, but you can't rely on it, is my view. I mean, there is no substitute for actually meeting people. I still think, and that's obviously going to be harder in the current environment if we're all working from home, and these things are less encouraged than they used to be, but it was an expected part, of my job.
No, and it'd be great if thanks, Lucy, for coming back. So Lucy's come back just to confirm that she's doing marketing analytics. So that's great, Lucy. Thanks to your question. And again, if students want to share the ways that you guys are keeping in touch, and that would be good. So Lucy said it's very helpful, thank you, with a smiley face. So that's good. Alistair, I think we've got one satisfied customer. Rob's put a question as well, Alistair, taking us sort of helpfully in a kind of broader direction, and I'll just read it just for your benefit. So hi, Alistair, you mentioned your passion was history, but I am intrigued whether you would say you have achieved everything you wanted to, and or if there are other professional ticks left on the bucket list, even after such a distinguished career.
Have I achieved everything? I think I was very happy to leave, to bring a close to my professional accounting career when I did. I can remember actually walking to the campus at Highfield thinking it'd be great to wonder if I could get a role with one of these big 8 firms. I didn't ever envisage being a partner of one of those firms. I benefited from a little bit of luck in my career, being in the right place at the right time. That's relevant as well, Philip, to be honest. You do need to be, there is something about being around when the opportunity is there. And I said I was approached to be a partner at EY in 1999. So I think I'd reached the point where the trade-off between the amount of effort and time that was involved relative to the payback of incremental promotions, etc. I'd reached that plateau in that to go to the next step. And I didn't particularly, I suppose my biggest leadership role, I had a team of about 250 in the global mobility group at EY. And so I'd seen the pressures of that leadership and management role of a team of that size. And obviously the way you progress from there is that you manage bigger and bigger teams and groups. I didn't like the look. I knew actually my line manager was a very good friend of mine. We were at Price Waterhouse together before EY. And I saw the role that he did, and I didn't really want it. The payback in terms of financial reward and extra time and commitment relative to that, I'd sort of reached where I was comfortable of. And at some point in all of our careers, we probably will reach at that point where you know, because there's only one person at the top in any organization, so we can't all get there. So, you know, you've got to be realistic. So obviously stretch and ambition is important, but I'd reached the time of my life when I thought, well, actually, I think I can happily close this book on this part of the career.
That makes sense, Alistair. It shows a very, again, that self-awareness, which has been a common theme in this talk. I would love if we could spend 5 minutes shortly, you know, just exploring a little bit your work at Oxford, particularly about your skills development with the graduate students. But just I'm conscious of things in the chat, Alistair. So Rob says thank you for that honest answer. So thanks, Rob, for the question. And then we've got a question from Juan Mamon. And forgive me, Juan Mamon, if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But hi, Alistair and Philip. But this is for you, Alistair. I have a quick question. How can or how could we survive in the disruptive world in terms of knowledge and skills? So it's quite an interesting one.
Well, I suppose the good thing about this working world compared to the one that is that it's much more digitized, and so you have access. You have access to a lot more remotely, don't you? So if I just think, obviously, I'm affiliated with the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, I could get technical training through that loop. You know, I could spend all my time, or as an academic historian, I could spend so much time attending conferences and meetings and updates and just requesting feeds on different sorts of information. So you've got to make the technology work for you if you're not in an office place role. The best experience you absorb as a sponge through the mentoring. You know, we haven't perhaps got time to go into that deep, but I learned so much by observation through being in an office environment. It's much harder, I think, to absorb things remotely. But you can obviously acquire a lot of knowledge and skills through your own networking, through the social media, retaining your contacts and your peers and things like that. So I think it's harder. If we get back into a working world where people are in the office more, I mean, I learned so much by observation.
That's great. Thanks, Alistair. Question from Matthew. From Matthew Hull. What would be your advice for someone considering switching career after 10 years plus and being known as the guy that is an expert in X?
Oh, that's really difficult. So so you've really got to back yourself, haven't you? So obviously by becoming the expert, you are the go-to person for so many. You've probably got other competitors you could go to, other career options that you could take with competitors. The parallel, I knew a colleague who was an expert in stamp duty. You know, it became narrower and narrower in tax until he just knew everything about stamp duty, but you know, about nothing else. And of course, you do expose yourself to having to stay in that environment to use the skills that you've specialized in. But obviously, if you want to retrain into something completely different, then you need to basically accept that there's going to be a lot of hard work involved, and it's going to be a lot of personal investment from you to make that work. And that used to be the case even switching from PwC to EY in the same field. Obviously, I lose my network. You know, I've got to start building my network. Largely, I've lost my network. I've got to start building my network from scratch. Now, I don't have the same transition of technical skills, but that would be. But for me as an historian, I had to. So basically, so I've become an historian, but I had to accept that having been at the top of one profession, I'm at the bottom of the next one. You know, in a way, but you have to accept that as an historian. That postgrad certificate that I did, I was right back to the basics. You know, I'd had a 30-year gap. I wanted to do history. But I had to accept that I wasn't going to just say I'd left as a partner at EY. You know, so you've got to. And so was I willing to do that? To be open enough to learn how to be an academic historian. So those, I think, are the sort of the challenges, and only you know the answer. Is you've got to weigh up the joy and pleasure of doing what you really want to do with the the rewards and security of being the expert that everyone goes to.
But that being said, Alistair, and this is a nice segue in. Thanks, Matt, for your question. It's a nice segue in for a couple of minutes into your role, one of your roles at Kellogg College at Oxford. Alistair maybe speaks a little bit to Matt's question. So in some way, you're doing this training with graduate students on skills development, and you've talked about a lot of those skills in this conversation this afternoon. But in some ways, you are for sure drawing on those non-technical skills that you developed while at Oxford. So in some ways that's not irrelevant to Matt's question. Could you tell us a little bit about what skills you're imparting?
Yes. So I mean, well, a very practical one would be academic writing. So for example, I learned to write in a business context. So I learned to write nice punchy reports in a particular style, but I had to learn a new style of writing, obviously in academia. You know, I was told very early, my sentences are too short and crisp. They've got to be more elaborate. You know, they've got to draw in the story. You've got to write in a different way. You've still got to write with clarity, but in a different style. Presentation techniques would be another obvious one, you know, where it's very different in academia than it is in the profession that I came to, but there's still commonalities and principles that you still seek to apply. So that would be a soft skill we teach. Team working, or no, critical reading is one that we're just going to put on. So, you know, as doing a PhD, you're reading literally dozens and dozens of books. How do you gut a book? You know, how do you take the essence of the book and the argument from that 400 pages? And it's interesting how often there were more parallels than I thought between the two career paths, as different as they sound.
Just exactly thinking that, Alistair, as you were talking, that academia and, you know, there are parallels there. And I know when we spoke before, you used the analogy of the iceberg. If you could maybe just use that as an illustration.
Yeah, I will. The things I started learning at Southampton was your ability to analyze data in all its complex forms, and take a really complicated situation, and the best people in my business context could explain the complex in a very clear and straightforward way. So we had technical gurus who were absolutely fabulous at the legislation and the case law, but you couldn't put them in front of a client because they couldn't explain it in a simple enough way that the client could grasp. So, you know, the skill that you need to develop is the iceberg, is that you've got under the water, you've got all this complicated, multifaceted situation that you're trying to advise on. And what pops out to the client in terms of either your meeting or your report to them is, you know, a very succinct, coherent, clear summary of what the problem is and what the options are. So you learn, you know, you've really got that's a really, really important skill to learn, and it becomes even more important. And it's just like, I was thinking about it actually, my DPhil or PhD, it's the same. You know, I mean, I produced 100,000 word thesis, but I probably researched 1 million words to produce that 100,000 word. There was an iceberg that I left on the cutting room floor, as we say. It didn't find its way into the thesis, and that 100,000 word thesis gets summarized into a 300 word abstract in terms of, you know, the main. So your ability to do that sort of thing, it was being an historian and an accountant, they were the same in the sense of you have a problem, you analyze the problem, you assemble data, you know, you sift through the problem, you find an answer, you present it verbally and in writing. You know, I mean, one was numbers, one was words predominantly, but the skills were remarkably similar. So now I would really value someone with a history degree, because I could see the logic, you know, the logic and how it would apply.
Very interesting, Alistair. It's something I'd love to explore in more depth. We don't have the time now, and we've got one more question which I'll put to you in a moment from the audience, which is good, and it'd be nice to kind of end on an audience question. But I do know that you and I are going to continue our link, and, you know, hopefully, I don't want to put you on the spot, although I guess I am in a way, Alistair, as you might, hopefully you'll be coming to Southampton at some point in the new year to share your experience and expertise, and I'm sure the audience and many others will really want to attend and benefit from that. So hopefully, folks, there will be more on, for example, how to develop those iceberg skills that Alistair has been referring to. But let's finish, Alistair, on an audience question. So this is from Simon Ward. Thanks for your question, Simon. If you get a chance, Simon, to put your what course you're on or your status at the moment in the chat, great. Hi, Alistair, can you talk a little bit about your journey into academia? Had you finished working when you did your postgrad?
Yeah, interesting. What I say, I've been thinking about retirement for a long time. Actually, we were trained how to retire. Actually, I went on courses on how to retire, because you think you go from an all-consuming employment role, which is really your identity, to cliff edge to nothing is not healthy. So I was trained about that, and so I went from 5 days to 3 days a week for the last 2 years of my working life. And in parallel with going 3 days a week, I then embraced academic study, because one thing I learned was that you've got to keep your brain active in requirement. I'm very passionate about lifelong learning and continuing education, and it's just interesting. So this was my chance when I went from 5 to 3 days to explore going back and being an historian. So I did that and segued once I'd given up, finally retired in 2012. I'd finished, I think, my postgrad certificate, and I went from there into a master's and into the doctorate after that. And I was the student rep, and I could see that there was a gap in terms of our university at Oxford skills and development training. There was so much around the university that was difficult to access. I could see there was going to be real power in drawing that together for students and making that pathway a bit clearer, but also drawing on the huge body of expertise from my fellow students, because these are mature students who've had great careers in all sorts of different fields, who've got great skills to bring to the party. So I started on this 0 hours contract when I finished my DPhil, and then got into this. They said, well, there's obviously a job here, and this is what the job that I now do. But so I'm putting together each term this skills and development program, talking to new tutors externally and within Oxford, talking to the student body about what skills and development they need, and then doing a bit of history in the side. So I sort of got into it by accident, and it wasn't designed and planned, but I'm really pleased that I do it, because it gives me this intellectual stimulation, and I enjoy working with students. I enjoy this whole area of development. So for me, it's an ideal sort of retirement part of my portfolio, if you like, this 2 days a week, which gives me my passion for history and the development side, and just keeps things ticking over.
Sounds to be like the perfect recipe for a healthy and intellectually stimulating retirement, Alistair, which is another theme we can explore together. So just a couple of comments, all really positive. So Matt says, thanks again for your thoughts, Alistair. And then as a kind of nice comment, will the in-person event, I think he's referring, when I asked you if you would be coming to Southampton, will be extended to alumni. So the short answer is yes. Matt, would love to have you along and join our current students in listening to Alistair and exploring things in more depth. And then Simon had just clarified that he's a program manager in a large IT company, and he did an MBA at Southampton in the early 90s. Okay. So he's obviously benefiting a lot. Alistair, it's just gone one. I am absolutely delighted with the conversation. I found it really interesting. The hour has just flown past for me, and I'm sure it has for our audience. So I would just like to thank you again for giving your time. And I'm quite sure this is not going to be the end of the relationship, and we'll see you in the near future in Southampton. But absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for having me, Philip. Thank you, everyone. Yeah, I look forward to in the new year. Perhaps I'd love to see everyone in person, because as I said, it's much better to do things in person. So hopefully we can make that happen early in the new year.
There's a couple of questions coming out. We won't take them now, Alistair. What I will say to the students is, if there's a burning question, I'm sure we can field them across to you, Alistair, if there's burning questions on behalf of the students. So but we're getting some nice comments. James is looking forward to the in-person event. I've already teed this up, Alistair, so we're past the point of no return. So once again, thanks a lot, Alistair. Okay. Enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks for joining us, everyone.
Bye. Bye.